Well, Dr. Jennifer Dragonette, welcome back to the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's really a pleasure to be back here and looking forward to spending more time with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this new season. Before we started talking, I had mentioned that you know you're going to be on a more frequent basis, which I'm really excited about. And as I mentioned in the previous episode I recorded with Dr. Taryn Clark, she's going to be on a more regular basis. So I think that we've got this great 1-2 punch with Dr. Dragonette and Dr. Clark covering mental health, which is your background, and then neurology or neuroscience, brain health, which is what Dr. Clark focuses on. So I'm really excited about the direction of the show and where we go, and can't wait to dive into some of these conversations. And I think the most interesting thing about having both of you on now is that there's so much overlap between what I do as a financial advisor, what you do as a therapist, and what Dr. Clark does as a neuroscience. So it's I can't wait to see where this goes, and I think the best way to kick things off is to talk about how money initially impacts relationships. I think I've had this conversation with many people before, and a few therapists that I work with within my firm, and people have this I think thought that they end up in somebody like yours office, a therapist, talking about money, but that's on the surface level. There's so many more underlying root causes that drive people to have conversations with you in a professional setting and trying to get their mindset right.
hmm Yeah, I think, money is such an interesting topic, particularly in therapy. So, in my clinical practice, I see a lot of couples and I see a lot of individuals. And when I work with couples, I'm going to almost always ask about money, even if it's not one of the main reasons they're coming in, because money is so symbolic. It's symbolic of our value system. It's symbolic of how our families' values were. It's symbolic of safety or health, right? So it means something to us. And if we think about, the history of money over time, it only means what meaning we ascribe to it, right? If we think money is really important, we spend a lot of time trying to get money, or, if we hate the idea of money, we would put it into a different bucket. And with couples, our values really underlie what those conflicts are going to look like and what those points of connection are going to look like. So money comes up in a lot of different ways. Money can come up around the concept of work and work-life balance and unpaid work, work within the home, work outside of the home. I see money come up in terms of, when can we retire? Can we take vacations? Are we comfortable spending money? Are we comfortable saving money? So there's so many different questions and layers that come in under the rubric of money. Money's kind of this umbrella category, but then underneath it, it means so many different things. And I'm curious for you, Paul, you work with so many people with, specifically around their finances. I'm curious what you see in your world when people come in. Do you see those kinds of conflicts coming up or those kinds of difficulty in communication around money?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point and question because I was just having a conversation with a new family that's coming on board the last week. And this comes up often for me where I become part of my role as as an advisor. There's some levels I become a therapist, and it's a fine line to balance on that side of the equation. But one thing that often comes up is that I become this third independent third party arbitrator that can um, help guide people in very emotional or stressful situations, and not just money related but personal life as well. As you well know in the audience, I work with a lot of families that tend to have a lot of kids, whether they have twins or triplets or three or more kids, or even two kids. One kid's hard enough, but when you throw kids into the family dynamics, it changes everything. And I think that couples, when they initially meet, start dating, get married, that's one component of their life and how they're working with money. But then when they start having kids, that introduces so much more complexity. And I think a lot of times, and I'm included in this, Teresa and I tell people often, Teresa and I have the same struggles as everybody else in America. Like, we're just because I'm a financial advisor and I do this for a living doesn't mean that we have it all figured out. And so, but what I see is people don't necessarily know, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a lot, like people's money scripts and what that actually means, because you have two people coming together and they both come from different backgrounds, as you kind of alluded to, and they were both m- more than likely raised in different money environments. And one good example that I see of this is when it comes to saving for college. I'd say 80% of the time I have a family that one 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 spouse had their family pay all their undergrad tuition. Then the opposite spouse, they had to pay the entire bill. So you can imagine there's a lot of tension and built up anxiety about, okay, what are we going to do? Because, one parent had it this way, the other parent had it that way. And again, that's where I kind of come in and help create some harmony. There's no such thing as balance, but I try to find some harmony.
I love that you just said that. You're right. And it's one of the things that I work with couples a lot. Things don't have to be exactly equal. And sometimes we have this sense of balance or fairness that is kind of from our childhood, that if we both get the same piece of the pie, that's fair. And and when we start getting into conversations with money with the person that we love, the person that we're married to, that we're raising kids with, there's different values that come into play. There are different definitions of fairness and contributions. And in many families, in most families, even if you have two parents who are working, they're probably not bringing in exactly the same number of dollars, but they may be bringing in different amounts of value into the family or different amounts of value in terms of the work that they do. So, when we start talking about money, one of the things that I recommend that couples do is they really push back from the table and think about what they appreciate in terms of their partner's contribution to the wealth of the relationship. Not the financial wealth of the family, but the wealth of the relationship, because there are a lot of different layers to wealth. And wealth could be the way that I attend to parenting. Wealth could be the way that I work really hard and bring in money. Wealth could be I'm building up a retirement fund or I'm helping with a college fund. But there are different things that people bring. And sometimes when we look at it just in terms of dollars or cents, we end up valuing or overvaluing the idea of bringing money in, and then we can get someone feeling shame, feeling like they can't talk to their partner about money because it feels inequitable or it feels unfair. So one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about just these conflicts, these underlying, and I don't mean conflicts like fights, I just mean disagreements or friction. I always say that we drag a suitcase full of stuff into our relationships when we start a relationship. And that suitcase is full of our childhood history, our parents' childhood history, previous relationships we've had, previous children we've had sometimes, right? All of these different things. And in our world, that suitcase just makes sense. That's the suitcase we've had. We've been adding to it for decades. And we get to a relationship and we open up the suitcase and we say, okay, here I am. And our partner does the same thing, and they open up their suitcase. And if we've chosen wisely, and if it's someone that we really connect with, a lot of those things in the suitcases are going to go together. Oh, this outfit looks great with that outfit. Fantastic. But there's always going to be something where there's friction because we're
I
different people.
I think that's a really great point that you just made about wealth not being financial only.
Hmm.
Because I think that's a point of emphasis that I try to work on with my own marriage with Teresa and with the TAMMA families I work with, especially in situations where one spouse or partner makes significantly more than the other. Or a really good case is when you have a stay-at-home parent, whether that's, you know,
Hmm.
mom, dad, partner, it doesn't really matter. Because I mean, there it's really cut and dry. Like that person's not bringing any income into the family, but look at all the other things that they're doing that allows that family to thrive.
Exactly, exactly. And it's easy to assume that we have the same values about things. because, with that suitcase analogy, we've had that suitcase our whole lives. That has been told to us that that's the right set of values. Maybe that was our parents' values. Maybe we had parents where one person worked at home and one person worked outside the home, and we've grown up thinking that that's what we want, or that's what we don't want, right? Sometimes our suitcase is filled with examples, negative examples from our lives, that didn't feel great. I never felt like my family had enough money growing up, and so I want to work really hard so I don't ever make my kids feel that way. So we come in with all of these different needs, values, expectations, and we make assumptions. And I think oftentimes with couples, it's the assumptions that get us really stuck. I assumed you wanted to pay for our kids' college, right? Just like you said. Or I assumed we would insist that our children pay for their own college. So if we don't empty out those suitcases and really take a critical look at them, we won't know what those assumptions are, and then we get stuck. And so when we're in the heat of the moment, and when our nervous system is flaring up, and we're in a conflict situation, or a last minute, oh, what do we do about this vacation, or how much do we save in our 401k? If we haven't had those conversations ahead of time, it can start to feel like someone's attacking our values, or the core of who we are, rather than, oh, wow, you were raised really differently than I was. And that's not good or bad. It's just different. It's just a fact. So those differences feel really, they feel a lot safer when we can discuss them in a calm state ahead of time, maybe even with someone like me or you, as a therapist or a financial advisor, versus in that moment of friction or in that moment of decision.
How do you how do you get couples to talk about that and to start letting being open or even letting their guard down so they're not they're not making decisions based on those assumptions and leading them to have you know healthy dialogue because it's one thing to have that dialogue with you and your office where it's maybe a little bit more comfortable, but then when you get outside of your office and the real world is melting down around you, you got kids going in multiple directions, career stress, it's that's where like the rubber meets the road. It's like the things that you learn in therapy that you're trying to apply like outside are kind of easier said than done sometimes.
Yes, yeah, they really are. I'm a big fan of having some sort of regular, consistent meeting with your partner, whatever that looks
I
like for
am
you.
too. I just find it horribly difficult.
It's horribly difficult, especially if you have children, especially if you have a busy life, especially if you feel a little avoidant, like, oh, this is going to be hard, or we're going to talk about tricky things, or, I don't want to feel distant from you. And so we often get into a space of avoidance about that kind of conversation. Oh, it'll be fine. We'll work it out when we get there. And avoidance is really related to anxiety, whether it's full-blown anxiety, an anxiety disorder, or just the feeling of anxiety. Whenever we feel nervous or anxious about something, we want to avoid that. And when we avoid it, it actually makes that anxiety worse. If we think about any sort of thing that we fear, like, oh, I don't want to open that bill because I'm afraid it's going to be so high. If we would just leave that envelope sealed, our anxiety gets worse and worse and worse until we just open it. So
That's
I
interesting.
recommend, yeah, it's just how anxiety works in general. And, we can talk all about anxiety in another episode. Um,
I'm sure we will.
I'm sure we will, and I want to. But with this kind of thing, I think if you can get into the habit, I have lots of couples where I say just do a weekly walk and talk, where every Sunday morning you go for a 30-minute walk together and you just deliberately talk about the things that you kind of haven't wanted to talk about all week. And the more you do that, the less scary it becomes, the more you see that you can make it through. And with those conversations, I always recommend that it's not to be hashing out things, deciding things, convincing each other of things. We don't convince each other of things very well. It's more a place of curiosity.
Yeah.
Interesting. Tell me more about that. Lead with questions. And I have lots of questions that I can share with you that I like to recommend to couples. Like, tell me more about that. Oh, so interesting. Wow, that's different than mine. But before I tell you my story, tell me more about yours, right? So even maybe framing that like this particular meeting is just for me to listen to you. And then the next meeting is for you to listen to me. So we're not trying to make each other see from my perspective. I'm trying to just get more clarity, more fullness about what it was like for you as a little guy, what you learned about money growing up, what your fears are about having enough, what does having enough mean to you, right? All of these questions that we might not ever take the time to ask.
What you just said, that's going to be another one of our, I think, hot topic episodes is talking about how uh to define enough and what enough is, because
Mm,
that's a topic that comes up with families I work with over and over again. I'm curious to know, because that's one thing I'm always trying to figure out is how to bring couples together to um coalesce around defining their purpose, because I think a lot of people think there's a stereotype of what a financial advisor does, and usually it's around the portfolio management side of what I do. Well, that's important. I keep emphasizing to people over and over again that it's really not the most important thing I do. And I think from my perspective, it's again creating or finding that harmony between a family's emotional life and personal lifestyle and their financial lifestyle, and you can't just look at them in individual silos. And so one of the things that I encourage people to do is go on a financial date night. I know it sounds really sexy. Um, but the point of that is to go and do something kind of like out of the ordinary or fun, or just go to dinner and have a conversation about it. But I think what people run into is like they're so worn down by the the daily, wear and tear of daily life, that when they get to that point, they're like, well, this is the last thing I want to talk about. So I'm wondering, like, going back to that walk and talk, which I really like, is there something about being like physically active, like walking rather than just sitting down at dinner? Because I always advise people, if you're going to do this, like try to do it outside of your house.
yes, yeah. There really is something about that, specifically walking. Our bodies like to be moving in that kind of right, left, brain, right, left hemisphere brain stimulation. We figure things out differently when we're walking and moving. Sometimes it just also releases some tension to be able to move your body. That this isn't a meeting. We're not sitting across a desk from each other and, having like a stern face. We're outside, we're thinking, we're breathing, we're getting all of our endorphins, are being re-regulated by the fresh air, by the sunshine. But there really is something about movement that is supportive. Sometimes, particularly if we start to have a nervous system flare up, we start to get a little hint of that fight or flight, which can happen so easily with couples. If we really are tracking our heart rate and you're sitting and talking to your spouse, if your heart rate goes over about 100, we probably want to take a break because we're getting flooded. We're getting into a nervous system reaction. So moving, walking while you're doing this can actually really help re-regulate that and keep you in a place. There's kind of an ideal amount of stimulation or dysregulation in our nervous system. Is there something called the anxiety curve, and we want a little bit of activation but not too much activation, so we want to be paying attention but not flooded. And so it's really true that movement can help with that, and it can just make it feel like an easier conversation to have.
So one of the things that I find interesting about the work that you do, that kind of dovetails into the work that I do, is trying to find this middle ground. As I just kind of mentioned, like trying to help people that come from very different backgrounds sometimes to find that sense of purpose. Um, are there are there things that you do in as a clinical licensed therapist, as a doctor of psychology? Like, how have you seen ways to get people closer to the table on these important topics?
Hmm. Yeah, what I often am going to
And
start
I'm sure
with.
the way I asked that question was probably not very good, because it's like very loaded. It's like there's a lot of probably conversations that happen, or steps along the way.
There are, and I think it's a valid question. That sometimes we can't get closer together until we understand each other. And so I start from that stance that I was just talking about. Let's imagine that we have curiosity about this rather than fear, because we get fear when we feel like something's going to be taken away from us. And money is a scary topic for a lot of people. If we go back, I like to go back a couple generations when I'm talking with couples about money. It's not just how you were raised, it's how were your parents raised, right? What were the values that your parents came into your life with around money? So we have a lot of people in our history to really look at and think about, and what was the value of work, right? All of these layers. And if we start from a place of I need to make you see it from my perspective, we're already kind of behind the ball there because we're not thinking, I want to see things from my partner's perspective. So there needs to be a little softening around that. Often I'll do a lot of work with couples in the beginning around what is the goal of this therapy or really of even this relationship, and to help them move out of the goal being you come to my side and we see things that way. Sometimes couples are kind of like going at each other as though they're enemies, and I always think the goal is to make them the team and facing out toward the world. And if you're the team, you have to know what your teammate needs and wants. They need to know what you need and want so that you too can take on this world together. And so sometimes in order to do that, we have to get at the stories. We tell ourselves stories, typically really painful stories, because we're trying to protect ourselves. So, oh, my partner doesn't value my unpaid contribution to the house because they think I'm lazy or they think I don't work hard enough, right? These painful, painful stories that their partner probably doesn't think, never said, right? But it's from history. It's from, watching the ways that your parents related to each other or getting these messages throughout your own personal history about the value of whatever we're talking about. So when I work with couples, and couples can do this on their own too, it's just you have to be really mindful of your goals. I try to get a lot of those early questions ironed out. What did you see? Right? What did your parents teach you about money? What did you learn about money? If you had to define this, just specifically around money, but we could take any topic, right? Sex, children, college, right? Anything like that. And what have been those values that you've carried with you around this? How does that show up in your life? How has that informed decisions that you've made over time? Sometimes I like to actually try to get couples telling each other stories about their lives. Like, what was the moment in your life that you were the most scared around money? Right? What was the scariest story that you've been carrying with you? Because guess what? That story is still playing itself out, right? Maybe you were having to file for bankruptcy at some point in your life, or maybe you went through a divorce, or maybe you were headed to college and at the last minute your parents told you there wasn't enough money. There's sometimes really, really painful stories that we might not even know about our partner. Or maybe we heard it years ago, but we kind of forgot that it was such a big deal to them, because it just wouldn't have been the same deal to us. So, to try to, I use this analogy a lot, kind of push back from the table that we're not here to try to make sure anything happens. We're just here to try to really listen and to give that person the same, grace and care that we would give to our best friend. Because sometimes when we're in relationship, that person becomes such a part of us that we
Yeah.
blow them off, that we blow ourselves off, right? But this person matters. We're saying that this is the most important person in the world. And so trying to deeply understand what their experience has been like, it's not just a vehicle to have better conversations. It's also a way to really meet this person eye to eye and see like the little guy that's still in there that is them when they were 6 years old that was told, no, we can't afford that, or no, you don't get to have that.
This is, oh my gosh, this is so interesting. Like my mind like it's just spinning. And I'm thinking back like Teresa and I started dating 20 years ago. We'll be married oh man. 18 years this October. And I'm thinking about like just people that are dating each other. I'm like, well, how comfortable are you going to feel like unloading all the skeletons in your closet about like, growing up in your childhood? You don't. And even like now I'm just thinking like 20 years later, I'm like, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with Teresa like that before. I'm like, and you're probably giving me the kick I need to be able to do that.
Well, and so it's interesting. I so appreciate you naming that. Congratulations on your almost 18 years. And if we think about, not to put you on the spot, but why haven't you had those conversations, do you think?
Yeah, it's got to be something around fear based. Like you had mentioned before, is there's something probably there that like I'm. maybe I'm ashamed to talk about or fearful to talk about. And so I just don't. And
Right. Yeah.
so I think, you know, I, you would know best, but is shame and fear are probably like the two biggest drivers of why communication breaks down.
Exactly, exactly. And listeners, I promise we did not plan this conversation, but that's exactly it, Paul. That's exactly it.
Oh yeah,
It's
that's a good point. Like audience, like none of this is planned. Like Jen and I talked about this about coming up with a topic to talk about when we have these conversations. It's going to probably be about at least once a month. Um, and probably now is as good as time as ever to encourage you if you have questions that you want to have us talk about and Dr. Jennifer answer for us. Please send those emails into me, and we'll make sure that we include it in our conversations.
Yeah, so so unprompted, right? You came up with exactly the number one thing I see, which is fear and shame. And shame is like this roadblock in front of us. Once we start feeling shame, shame is something's wrong with me. Right? That's the message that shame tries to get through. It's horrible, right? Something's fundamentally wrong with me. I'm not lovable the way I am. I'm not good enough the way I am. The way I feel about this is wrong, right? So when we get into that shame space, even if it's just low on the spectrum of shame, it's gonna stop us in our tracks. And it's so heartbreaking because usually what shame is telling us is don't approach, right? Don't get close, don't share, don't open up, which is exactly the wrong message. Because when we don't do that, then we don't get all this information. And time and again, I always want to have a caveat, like a little asterisk, that there are some relationships that are not safe, that are not healthy. And if you're in one of those relationships, you probably feel it at least on some gut level. And maybe these aren't safe conversations to have. So, putting that out there to be really clear. In the majority of couples I see, which really the majority of couples are loving and healthy enough to have these conversations, what I often see is that when we kind of break that barrier of shame, when you kind of tentatively put a foot out and say, hey, there's something I'd like you to know about me, time and again, there's more closeness after that conversation. Intimacy is not caused by safety. Intimacy is caused by openness and vulnerability and breaking through the shame and letting somebody in closer to you, kind of increasing the willingness to have them see you as you are. And if we kind of veer very quickly over to attachment, which is probably another topic we can talk about sometime, when we feel attached as a child to our parents, what we really want is to be seen and known and loved for who we are and to be seen as competent. Those two things. We want that from our partners too. We want to be seen and known and loved for exactly who we are, but we can't get that unless we show them who we are, right? So if we have this block against really revealing or opening up, that we're never going to truly feel loved because we know we're not sharing everything. We know we're hiding something or we're being reluctant to open up. So in order to fully attach, fully and completely, there's this expectation like I'm sharing everything with you. You're sharing within reason, right? Everything with me. But there's anxiety about it. And exactly as you said, it's kind of like, gosh, I've never had these conversations. And it can feel like, well, too much time has passed, right? We've been together for 20 years. It's too late to open up these conversations. And I just want to say that it's really not. It sometimes can be fascinating or really fun. I love your idea of a financial date, right? To go and just say, all right, let's talk about all this stuff. I realize I don't know this about you, right? You don't know this about me. And there's so much power in saying to your loved one, I feel a little nervous about saying what I'm about to say, right? I mean, you can kind of feel the temperature in the room change when you say something, but in my mind, it's one of the bravest things we can say is I'm about to tell you something that I've been nervous to say or that I've been feeling ashamed to say. And you better believe if my partner says that to me, I stop what I'm doing and I pay
Yeah.
attention, right?
Well, Dr. Jennifer Dragonette, I think that's a really good point to close on this initial conversation and having you back on. And I can't think, there's so many great takeaways. So, listeners, be sure to check out the show notes because I'll put some of those in it along with links to Jen's website. And again, I can't thank you enough for joining me, and so excited about where we're heading with this going forward. Thanks, Jen.
My pleasure, Paul. It's great. I really appreciate you having me on and look forward to more conversations.